Hey up and welcome to the Temple of Blair. Sometimes you have the great pleasure of speaking to someone who makes you look like a bumbling, moronic child who's just wet their pants. In a good way, obviously. And as such, I'd like to introduce you to Stephen Hill. I reached out to Stephen because he's got two absolutely banging articles on Roadrunner Records that he did for Metal Hammer. If you just type in Roadrunner Records, Stephen Hill, you'll come across them. It's basically one about 1993 and one detailing some of the more underappreciated Roadrunner records that are out there. Stephen also hosts two podcasts which are near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. One is We Are the Road Crew, in which he interviews a number of live sound engineers and otherwise from the metal industry. And another one is the Riot Act podcast, which he details as a alternative music podcast, but we go into a bit more detail on that at the start of this. But Stephen knows his shit. He knew right out the gate what I was trying to explore, and I'm eternally grateful for his dialogue and his valuable articulation and memory and all this great stuff. So check out the links in the description for Riot Act, because if you're a fan of Stephen's way of navigating the subject area, then Riot Act podcast has it in fucking spades. So let's get into it. 1, 2, fuck shit up. Could you talk about Riot Act and We Are the Road Crew?
Yeah, sure, man. So Riot Act is an alternative music podcast. I mean, that's as vague, it's kind of deliberately vague, like alternative music as a sort of concept, I guess, has becoming more and more, those lines are blurring all the time. And so I think it's kind of deliberately vague because like I love talking about metal. I love quote unquote rock, but I like lots of other things as well. And you get to a certain point where you think, well, I kind of want to talk about as much other stuff as I possibly can. And I sort of found myself post doing a lot of quite metal centric and rock centric stuff.
Yeah.
And then not doing a few bits of those things, finding myself listening to like, just music that I listened to when I was a kid. Like it took me, as we'll probably discuss in a little bit when we talk about the label, like I didn't go straight in on rock and metal. Like I really liked Madness and The Cure and U2 and Madonna and stuff like that. And I don't know if Madonna, is Madonna an alternative artist? Like not really, but because it's vague enough, you sort of go, well, Madonna is she's not a typical pop star. So, would we talk about Madonna and Riot Act? Yeah, probably, but I'd quite like to throw it in with, a new Obituary album. And I think that's sort of the beauty of it, because I love the fact that people don't seem to really, and people aren't as tribalistic as they used to be, I don't think. And I think that's good.
Oh, totally. I mean, I was listening the other week and I was like, I've been waiting for a mature conversation about post 2010 Weezer for like 10 years. And I was glowing from like just the comments about how Rivers is sort of orchestrating the band's career now. And I was like, yes, because to say everything past 2010 or anything past Pinkerton is shit is unacceptable for dialogue for me. And it feels like we know that the pinball aesthetic of how that band sort of touches different genres and stuff, it's all by meticulous design, and that's what I like to look at and unpack. And it gets to speak to the Roadrunner stuff in a way, because none of this is an accident. He's doing it for a fucking reason, and I just think it's great. I think it, in a way, and this is a really bold statement, I think like they're probably one of the most important bands today for that reason. One, because they're challenging what it means to brand yourself in a band. Also, just the sheer productivity, but to every 9 to 18 months of the new album. And that's very important, really, for me, if you're trying to think about how people interface with a band and a brand and how the album cycle works. There is a rhythm to it. Not with Weezer. It's just, let's just get it all out. And I think that's really important.
And the world's changed so much. The way that people consume music, the way that people think about music has changed so much. And I think, I would like to think that if I'd been in a band for 30 years, that when you hit kind of 20 years of being a band, you could do, what was funny about that Weezer, I think what was kind of perfect about when we reviewed Van Weezer was that we went straight into talk about Teenage Fan Club afterwards. Now, Teenage Fan Club and Weezer basically are the same band, just from different islands. Both of them just continue to make music for years and years and years and years. No one's talking about Teenage Fan Club. Because Teenage Fan Club are, you know, if you want me to sit here with my, you know, sub pop 90s grunge, you know, this music means this and it should be this, and if you want me to go back, like back then, I'm sure if you'd have showed Rivers what he was getting up to now in 1994, I'm sure he would go, oh my god, what am I doing? Yeah. And I'm sure Teenage Fan Club would go, yes, good, we've been really, you know, we've stuck to the path, and we have this kind of artistic credibility, and we've never stopped. But one of those bands is interesting and the other one isn't. And you know, I think come the day of reckoning, like more people will remember Weezer for, you know, Teenage Fan Club is just a band who supported Nirvana in the 90s, and they carry on putting out middling kind of alternative rock records. Whereas Weezer, I mean, that's an interest, you know, it's just an interesting thing. And I think it's very easy to go, oh, look at them and be snobby when you're 40 and you remember how great it was when Pinkerton came out. But like, you know, the world's different. And I think, and you know, you're right. Like, I mean, I appreciate you saying it was a kind of mature conversation, because I've kind of done a lot of like just slagging stuff off. And I'm kind of bored of just of deliberately slagging stuff off now. So the challenge to find what is good about this, I think, is kind of more interesting. It might not be more interesting to listen to. It's sort of more interesting for me to go, you know, like I think we did The National and Full of Hell was always the one that I remember, where we did those two together in the same week. And we were like, both of these records are absolutely incredible. And there's no reason, like I was saying, there's no reason why you shouldn't like both of those things. You just got to be in the mood for one or in the mood for another. And, you know, music should kind of, that spectrum should be as vast and as broad as possible. So that's kind of what we try and do with Riot Act, I think.
I think that's what Rivers is thinking as well. It's like, yeah. If you're in for a post-grunge angst, go back to Blue and Pinkerton. And we know we can deliver that because we did it with the White Album, and everything will be all right in the end. We know that. I think he's going 50 years in the future and going, well, the stuff that will come out, the stuff that people will remember will be contextual. If you want like sort of synth pop, sort of with a guitar song structure, then yeah, maybe Pacific Daydream will be the album of 2040. But, you know, for the meantime, I'm just having fun, you know, going between these things and churning out an album every 9 and 18 months. I think that's just...
People will even think about it as the album of what, you know, it's kind of like we almost exist in moments these days, don't we? So I would be, people will remember, you know, them doing Africa, like Toto. I mean, I can't get on with the Teal album. It is awful. Like it's awful. But, you know, people are going to remember that. And I think it's at least like they elicit strong opinions in people. And I think and sort of strong conversations in people. And it's easy to just dismiss them and go, Pinkerton happened and then they were rubbish. And like that's, I mean, that's obviously not true anyway, but anyone who says that's an idiot, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's post Last Jedi world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where like, there's no tribalism, but there's also on the extreme, there's extreme tribalism. Yeah. And I think part of our maturity as a race is being able to brand the extreme tribalism as not valuable dialogue. And then we count the minutes we spend on that non-valuable dialogue and go, this is wasted fucking time. What value can we derive from, say, Teal or whatever? But yeah, my point is, thumbs up at having a good conversations about Weezer, and people should listen to Riot for that. Could have free flows as well. It's good. I mean, I could talk about Eval and thrash and stuff like that, but I also want to talk about We Are the Road Crew podcast, which I think it's an unsung perspective of the entire industry, which I think you've shown a light on really, really well.
Yeah, well, we're going to try and start doing them again. I mean, so basically we've my friend Ben, who I knew from when he kind of offered up his studio. He's got a really lovely studio in the centre of London called Factory Studios, like right in the heart of Oxford Circus. And he kind of offered it out to us when I was doing the previous podcast, when I was doing That's Not Metal, the previous podcast I was doing. And he's just a lovely guy, and he kind of got hold of me and he said, I've got this idea, like he's worked as a road crew and he's worked in studios his whole life, and he was like, I think these people have really interesting perspectives. And the thing is, they do, like you actually find that I think I've always kind of thought that bands, when people say, oh, you know, you as a reviewer or whatever, what do you know? The band don't think that. Well, I don't actually think sometimes when you make art yourself or when you're in the middle of that stuff, I think sometimes your perspective on that can often be the least interesting perspective on it because you're just in it. It just kind of comes out of you. Yep. And, you know, people don't always know why they make the art they make or why they do the things they do. But I think if you get someone who's really close to that person, then they can say, kind of a bit more objectively, like this was actually what it's like. And we've had people like, you know, Peter Hintz, who worked with Queen, was the first one that we did, and he was unbelievable. You know, he worked with Freddie Mercury every day for about 15 years. And, you know, obviously no one can talk to Freddie Mercury now, but that him as a person and him as a, you know, as an icon, you know, he's an unbelievably iconic figure, an unbelievably famous person with so much charisma and such a like very clear public persona. What do you actually really like as a person? And I think you're not going to get that from a journalist. You're not going to get that from somebody who just is a Queen super fan. You're not going to get that from someone who's watched hours and hours and hours of footage of, you know, endlessly watched Live Aid or, you know, gone through Bohemian Rhapsody. But you might get it from somebody who knew him when they were an unsigned band. Yep. All the way up to them playing Wembley Stadium in 1986 and work with him every single day. So, you know, if you get the right people on that show, and more often than not, I think, though, you know, that there have been people who have been really interesting, who have worked with massive stars, people like Michael Jackson and Elton John and, you know, Sabbath and huge artists. But then there have been people who are a bit younger and have worked with smaller artists, but you can kind of see how excited they are at the idea of, you know, because it's a dream job for a lot of people working in music. It's not ever something, if you're a fan of music, that you should take for granted. Yeah. And it's great to talk to someone who's like, you know, oh, I came up working with Enter Shikari. I came up working with, you know, even Youngblood or the 1975 or Sports Team or some of these newer bands, but still gets as excited by the idea of that as, you know, someone who spent their, you know, their teens drum teching for Black Sabbath. Like that's amazing. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad you think it's a kind of you know, I'm glad you think it's a kind of an unsung podcast. I don't really hear many people, like not many people talk to me about it online or anything, but some people, I think we get like a few people listen to it, I think, but it's maybe not as sexy sounding. Yeah, totally. Things, but it's cool. It's really cool.
Like I can try and give people an entry point from my perspective because I do live sound as well in a much sort of more baby capacity. But I was speaking to another engineer who worked a Foo Fighters gig, and this is the comparative experience. So I've worked with bands who spent 45 minutes at sound check and just doing a line check, simply just making sure things work, screaming, bawling, throwing fists, you know, everything you can imagine. And then when you speak to some of the experienced guys, it's like, oh yeah, the Foo Fighters, yeah? It was a 15-minute line check. And then just take those two experiences and go, all right, well, what's the difference between those two perspectives of those two artists? What world are they living in which generates that kind of output? That's kind of, those are the kind of questions which are explored on that podcast. Obviously not necessarily exactly as I've presented them, but that's the world they live in. And that's kind of the personas and it's the social environment they need to navigate to get the job done. Because getting the job done, it turns out, is actually really fucking hard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's always better the show when people are willing to kind of open up on, because, you know, ultimately you do want to go like, I wonder what that artist is like. I mean, there was somebody once, I won't say who it was, but there was somebody who was quite a bit like, oh, I'm still working with this band, and I kind of called them out. So can you cut that bit of the podcast out? And I was a bit like, that's a real shame, because it was a really good insight into a big Hollywood A-list superstar who may or may not be. Let's call his band 40 Minutes to Saturn, and try and go out there. But yeah, who may or may not be an absolute dickhead. But yeah, he may just cut it out. So that's a bit of a shame. But you know, I can understand that because obviously he's still working in that environment.
Yeah. It happens a lot. I mean, one you were talking about artists and their perspective and how, you know, they're the one behind the guitar, making sort of the aura happen. This kind of leads quite nicely into the Roadrunner stuff, because a lot of the bands I interview, some of their tenures weren't exactly long with Roadrunner. Their thoughts on Roadrunner as a label were aren't too favorable, but some are also like, oh yeah, we did one album then got dropped, but we understand the interfacing between the band and the machine that is Roadrunner and the vehicle that it was for such important metal and such groundbreaking stuff. And I think that's the genesis of this project, is understanding that, because it did things which no other label has done. It made certain things viable which weren't viable previously. And it's not, I should really do the maths on it. But in terms of gold records and platinum records, I don't think there's a lot from many other labels. I think Roadrunner is like the chief body which generated that kind of output. I mean, no, we don't really care about sales, but it does say something. And for me, if you take the trajectory of Roadrunner and what it did, if you take it to its logical conclusion, let's assume it's still independent today. What would metal be like today if you still had platinum artists being generated from the fringes of music and having a seat at the table and disrupting the industry status quo? So really, the project is taking the learnings of that journey. Obviously, there's a historical context and there's some rock and roll stories and some sexy context in there. But for me, it's about, well, how do we as our generation learn from how they administered their metal? So jumping into that. Yeah. When did you discover Roadrunner as like an entity, as call it a brand, call it a thing? When did that little candy bar logo become synonymous with other things for you?
Probably for me, I mean, I sort of said, I sort of hinted at earlier, even though I got into guitar music during, I guess, probably the grunge boom, and then probably into like pop punk as well, or skate punk, as you have to call it now, to differentiate it from, awful stuff. And I do remember, Sub Pop and Epitaph were probably the first time that I paid attention to the idea of a label, I mean, particularly Epitaph at that time, because Offspring, Rancid, and Bad Religion, No Effect, Pennywise, Down by Law, all that kind of stuff was really big in my school. And so I'd never really thought about a label before, probably until I thought about Sub Pop and until I thought about Epitaph. And when I started thinking about wanting to get into heavier music, I was sort of saying to people, like, what should I listen to? Metallica being a really kind of obvious one. But I saw Roots by Sepultura I think it got to number 2 or 3 in the UK album chart, which is unbelievable. Like, do you know what I mean? That is like, to think of that today, that is an incredible thing to happen. Sepultura at number 2 in the UK album chart. In the 90s, when by all accounts metal was dead and no one cared about it, do you know what I mean? Like, unbelievable. In the UK, madness. So I was like, I should probably check this band out. I think I've said it a whole bunch of times before, but I saw the video for Rat Mahatta on the chart, the now defunct chart show on ITV, and I bought the single for that. And I used to get Kerrang a lot, and I think I probably didn't pay attention to Roadrunner, the label, on the Rat Mahatta single. But once I heard that, I was like, oh, fucking hell. And I saw they were playing the Donington Monsters of Rock in 1996. Now, if you look at that last Monsters of Rock at Donington in 96, you've got Sepultura, Fear Factory, Dog Eat Dog, Biohazard, and Typo Negative. So like pretty much half the bill is Roadrunner bands. And I remember sort of looking at that and being like, And those 5 bands, I mean, as a period of time for that as a kind of microcosm, as an example of the breadth of Roadrunner Records, Typo Negative, Dog Eat Dog, Fear Factory, Sepultura, Biohazard, 5 bands who basically have nothing musically in common but a slight kind of veer into, you could go, Dog Day Sunrise on Demanufacture by Fear Factory is a little bit goth, a little bit like Typo Negative. Dog Eat Dog kind of came through the hardcore scene a bit like Biohazard did, but there's not a lot of like crossover in sound in between those 5 bands. But yet weirdly, like some kind of odd dysfunctional family, they all kind of look the same. Do you know what I mean? They all kind of, even they didn't sound anything like each other, and they didn't actually look like each other or act like each other, but they all kind of felt weirdly connected in some way. You could join the dots from Dog Eat Dog to Biohazard to Fear Factory to Sepultura to Type In. You could kind of do that. And I think I saw in Kerrang some sort of advert for Roadrunner Records at this, at Donington, with those 5 artists being shown, and they had all these other things. And you suddenly see all the artwork from Life of Agony, Obituary, Deicide,
Mhm.
Machine Head, like, and you go, oh, they're all on the same label. All these bands that I keep getting told are really cool and they're in Kerrang all the time, and they appear to be on the same record label.
Yeah.
And Roadrunner, like, you know, they were marketing wise, they were super, super clever at that time, because the Drill in the Vein video, when that came out, and they had all their, you know, kind of a package video of all the stuff they did. And you could buy 2 albums for like $12.99 or something, so you could get like cheap versions of it if you bought the video, and then you get the video for £2 or something, or they're like 2 for 22 quid, and then you could get like the video.
I didn't know this. I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I didn't know the deals went down to like retail level. I know
Yeah.
they always did like loads of promo stuff, loads of videos, and I think there was like themed compilations like Breaking Barriers and Christ, what was the RC one? It was like a death metal one. The Pain compilation or something like that with all the death metal there. But yeah, I didn't know they were like, let's maybe cut our gains a little bit and bundle these together in the shops.
Yeah, I mean, you would walk into, I mean, and it's like, you know, like a Virgin Megastore that didn't have a metal section, so everything was rock and pop. And then you have the dance section. This is kind of pre them having a rock and metal section in a lot of the shops. And I walked in, and you're like, you got to flick through, like, oh, if I want to find a Machine Head album, I got to flick through Mark Morrison and Morrissey, and do you know what I mean, just to get to see if I can find Machine Head. But then, like, you walk in and there's a display, and it's just Roadrunner Records, and you're like, oh, I like Sepultura. What else is here? And then they're in front of you, and you're like, well, if I've got 22 quid, I can get a VHS video and 2 albums from this band, and then suddenly, boom, you're in. It was incredibly clever, but it would have meant very little if those albums weren't amazing, you know?
Sure.
And I think the beauty of, when I look back and people talk about the kind of iconic record labels from metal's sort of early era into the kind of going into the sort of the pay dirt of nu metal and whatever, they're all quite specific. Do you know what I mean? Like Relapse is quite a, you've got stuff like Neurosis and the Red Chord, or you know, the Locust on Relapse, like extreme shit. Earache was mostly death metal, mostly kind of grindcore.
Yeah.
And Metal Blade, again, you know, you got lots of thrash, the early on, like lots of thrash stuff on Metal Blade, but Roadrunner, or like Victory Records, just loads of hardcore bands. Whereas, and I mentioned kind of Epitaph and Sub Pop, and you know, like very specific styles of music. Whereas Roadrunner, I always thought the beauty of it was you've got death metal bands, like really like early adopters of death metal, you know, shit like Suffocation, and I mentioned like Obituary and Deicide being on that label as well. Yeah. But then you've also got Dog Eat Dog and Shelter. So you've got these really fun, and stuff like Junkie XL, who went on to do the Elvis. Like, I've got Saturday Teenage Kick. Like, why would I have bought that record? I bought it because it was on Roadrunner. It's the only reason I bought it. Like, it's a dance album. It's a fucking dance album.
Yeah.
A full-blown dance album. And again, weird, like Dino Cazares from Fear Factory plays on that record. Like, again, it's a kind of weird little incestuous world. You think, well, those things don't really have that much to do with each other. But they made them have stuff to do with each other because they were on Roadrunner. And even though it's a really, really brilliantly eclectic roster that they had at that time, it all still felt connected as well. So it's a really difficult balancing act that they pulled off, I think.
One thing I can't understand the entry point to is the death metal bit. Because we got all those Florida death metal bands, and we've got Morrisound Studios and Scott Burns, and we've got the legacy afterwards. And we've got those like family trees that it comes from, but I don't know what possessed them to go. I'm trying to find a pattern where there is none. I think that's the problem. I don't know why Monty Connor is sat there going, okay, I want Obituary, I want Deicide, and I want these. And they're all, I keep thinking that they're all some sort of package. They're obviously not. I think that the chronology of it is they just picked bands they liked. And by chance, the Morrisound guys just gave a shit about how it sounded. So those things just worked as a package production, a package production delivery vehicle. But it's, as you say, it is weirdly by design in terms of things that are interconnected. But at the same time, at that time with the label, especially 95, 96, is when they're actually investing in massive diversification. They acquire Third Mind Records for Frontline Assembly, which is what gives birth to that Fear Factory sound. They've got dance imprints that aren't very successful, but Junkie XL somehow manages it. But it is interesting when we talk about 95, 96 and those lineups where there is certainly a Roadrunner package, but no one remembers all the other stuff that was going on around it, like Star and Blue Mountain, which was like a country band and like a folk band and things like that. Yeah.
You don't remember that.
Yeah, it's bonkers basically. But one thing you touched on something that's really important. When I do that sort of US studies, the retail side of things, it's obviously managed by the distribution arm of the business. And back then it was Important Record Distributors / Sony Red. That's the company that did it. And I always try and pick about, well, how did we utilize, the Roadrunner brand and how do we get that sold in shops? And there's a lot of interesting stories about like the campaign to get Bloody Kisses Gold in the States, which was fucking huge. But you've touched on the UK experience because I never knew that there were those bundles together. I know who was distributing them. I think it was Pinnacle. But now I'm going to have conversations on that front and figure out what was by design and what was just the distributor going, yeah, we just have these relationships with Virgin Megastore. Let's put these up on front. Because it is massively important, especially when you think about the acquisition of artists, which is like the advance isn't amazing. There might be a better deal at Metablade. There might be a better deal at Relapse or something like that. But this is what speaks to how Roadrunner is a viable vehicle for a certain brand. Can Roadrunner deliver your band up to the mainstream, or does it have a better chance than anyone else? Yes. How do we know? Because of all these different marketing things, which they've got their fingerprints all over. It's mad. Yeah,
I mean, they were definitely the best at doing that. Like without doubt. I mean, it's mad to think, because I'm I've sort of known Monty Connor a little bit now, which is pretty weird when I consider it, because I looked at Monty Connor like, this is the guy. He's like the mastermind of this huge, massive like imprint label that, in my mind, maybe this is kind of naivety as a young man, but I kind of imagined Roadrunner Records to be this, the only metal label that was run in a massive skyscraper building with, people in suits, and do you know what I mean? Like in my head, I was like, well, Roadrunner's different to everything else. Earache, yeah, you run that out of the back of your garage or whatever. And even Epitaph, like selling 7 million copies of Smash, I still was like, oh, it's Brett Gerwitz in his shed, like, kind of folding things. And I'm sure, there's a definite middle ground to both those things. But Roadrunner, to me, like I think they just sort of presented themselves like a major label. I always considered Roadrunner to be, even when they weren't really, I always sort of considered, in my mind, they felt like a major label. If a band signed to Roadrunner, a metal band, immediately you're like, well, they've got an unbelievable chance of doing something.
Of cracking. Yeah.
Whatever that is,
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, and it's kind of crazy when you think that there's not many bands that you can think of, but I think the ones that are huge and had to be on big labels. I mean, you think like System of a Down ended up being on American and having the sort of backing of Rick Rubin, which was huge. Korn were on Epic, which is a massive label. Deftones were on Maverick, which is owned by Madonna. So unless you were on, and it's hard to think of any other bands who around that period who managed to have that kind of impact. I mean, those bands sort of stick out purely because they weren't on Roadrunner. You almost look at them and go like, oh, isn't it mad that they did that without being on Roadrunner? I was always a bit weirded out that like Deftones weren't on Roadrunner. And I know there are some artists like you mentioned too. I'm sure Glassjaw would be like fuck off, I don't want to talk about it, sort of thing. But they had to go on a major for their next records after splitting with just and even that at the time it didn't feel like as big a deal, that second Glassjaw record, than the first one did, purely because I don't know, it just, they weren't on Roadrunner anymore.
Yeah, it's the more I unpick the mechanics of it, the more interesting it gets. Because when you first at surface level, you think Case Vessels, Belgian, fucking Dutch businessman, veteran of the music industry, builds a house and fills it with metalheads, and that's the model. And then the more you get into the characters like Monty Connie, you start assuming like a Gandalf Bilbo relationship. You start assuming there's a stringent mentorship in terms of what happens, and there is something there. But Case, he was predominantly focused on the business aspect of the label, and he really just let the nutters run the madhouse in terms of the metalheads who actually occupy those buildings. But he also had a hand in absolutely everything. You couldn't spend a penny without his signature. So there were some restrictions in there, and it'd be good to understand like where the dynamics between Monty and Case as to how he'd convince Case to sign off on certain bands. Because his batting rate is remarkably high for an A&R person, remarkably high. It's a very dark art. And I couldn't even say exactly how many misses he's had, because misses is a disingenuous term, because you don't miss in A&R. The band just responds to a different incentive, which is somewhere else. But the amount of bands which he did get and then turned a profit is much higher than most people in that industry, not just metal, but across the board.
It's pretty phenomenal. I mean, even when you get into, I'm not sure if he was still there was he still there during Trivium? I mean, definitely for Killswitch, he was still there.
He was there up until 2012. So yeah, he was there for Trivium.
So even when you think, when it was becoming a lot harder, I think, in the sort of mid-noughties to still have that impact. I think there was a little kind of wobble at the turn of the millennium, and actually, that on reflection, stuff like 36 Crazy Fists and Chimera, maybe not Downer, but there was a little period where they signed a few bands where you're like, this is not really happening in the same way as it was. But then to come back with, Killswitch Engage, I mean, Killswitch Engage and Trivium are obviously the two big ones from that period. So still, like 3 Inches of Blood, it's a great record.
Fucking love it.
And then I suppose that's when he signed stuff like Porcupine Tree and Megadeth, who are a bit more kind of legacy.
That was Mike Gitter, Megadeth.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know that. Yeah. So but then in like Korn sign on as well, don't they? Lamb of God. You're starting to get bands who are a bit more established rather than
his last one was
bands themselves.
Yeah. I mean, the last one he did, just to give you an idea of the timeline, was Gajera. That was his last signing to Roadrunner. And there's a good story about that on Rob Flynn's podcast where he goes on to that, and everyone in the room was like, "This is fucking brilliant. This is a game changer. Well done, Monty. You did it again, boy." And then Case was like there with his head in his hands, like, "What the fuck have you done?" Because he just didn't see it. That's how that dynamic was. Like, Case could veto anything. He didn't on that time, but it's an interesting dynamic. There is something to be said about the pre-2000 and post-2000 period, and the biggest catalyst for that is Slipknot and Nickelback. Which I'm sure we'll come to at some point. But I wanted to ask you, because for me, the defining sort of era for Roadrunner was that Trivium one. Because to answer my own question, which is when I realized they were an entity, was when I found out that God Forbid weren't on Roadrunner. When Constitution of Treason was out, and I was like, this isn't Roadrunner? This is so strange, because it seemed like aesthetically like really well matched. But yeah, what's your sort of defining era of Roadrunner? Because a lot of people will say that 90s were the heyday, and I'm thinking, well, for you, yeah, but
yeah, I mean, it's probably pretty obvious that I would say that if anyone's ever listened to me speak about anything before. But I also think it's kind of quite difficult to argue the facts that that is a period where, like I say, you've got the only metal festival in the UK, and half of the bill is bands on Roadrunner, and they're not anything like each other. I mean, you can chuck in Machine Head as well. I mentioned Shelter. I mean, there's stuff that came out that maybe didn't even get hugely popular. Like, I'll probably talk about Imprint by Vision Disorder and the Vision Disorder album. Like, unbelievable records. I mean, you know, and even Cold Chamber were like, yeah, now you look Cold Chamber a bit hokey now, but Cold Chamber were massive. They were massive.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
you know, I think it's, you know, it felt like every definitive metal band. I think you could look at the mid noughties period, and you could probably go, well, actually, with Bullet was, did the Poison didn't come out? That wasn't on Roadrunner, was it?
No, I don't think so.
No. So when you think of like the big bands from the mid noughties in metal, like a lot of them were like, you know, Trivium and Killswitch were on that label, but then Avenged and Bullet weren't, if you're going to call them kind of big four. Whereas in the 90s, maybe just before Korn coming out, Machine, I suppose Pantera kind of, I guess, would be the kind of outlier in that as well, that Pantera went on the label. But neither was Slayer. I feel like I'm now totally remembering to kind of totally undermine myself in terms of like newer bands. So Pantera have been around for, but if you go to kind of '94 when Pantera are suddenly on their third album, but you've got Burn My Eyes coming out, you've got Chaos AD coming out. I know obviously it's a bit more of a slow burn for Sepultura, but Chaos AD, and you mentioned Bloody Kisses and River Runs Red, and like Mantra by Shout was about to come out. All Borough Kings by Dog Eat Dog was a debut. Demanufacture broke about a year later, and you had sort of Solon of the New Machine coming the year before that. It's just an unbelievable, like, fertile, creative period for bands on their first record, or their first couple of records, or their kind of commercial breakthrough. It felt like everybody broke almost within the space of about 18 months. All these records that are now considered legitimate genre classics kind of broke in that period between kind of mid 93, or kind of the first half of 93 into the sort of end of 1994. When you look at everything that came out in that period, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's really, really like the hottest hot streak you can imagine. I think even if you go to the mid, like there's a bit of a gap between Alive or Just Breathing and Ascendancy. It's probably about 18 months, but nothing that you would really go, well, that is an all-time.
True.
Nobody can deny that that is a classic metal record. I mean, I'll give you those two. And I think End of Heartache probably came out just after Ascendancy, or quite soon after Ascendancy as well.
Just before, like about 4 or 5 months before.
Yeah, okay, right. I knew it's sort of similar time. Yeah. But that's two bands and 3 records, as opposed to, you know, lots of records by lots of different bands.
Yeah,
I find it hard to kind of look past that. Although I wanted to give a quick shout out to the kind of the tail end of the sort of Slipknot happening alongside some bands I think probably could have been bigger deals. If maybe, I mean, I said Glassjaw, Amen would be another one as well. There were a bunch of bands around that period, I think, that were really good on the label as well, but just probably didn't hit commercially as much as they might have wanted them to.
Yeah, it's interesting when you make the comparison of like there's hot streaks, because my thing with the sort of 2005 era, I call it, just because when I was 16, I think it's having a streak, a kind of streak, as not quite as acute, not quite as compressed a streak, but in a space which is dealing with a perceived oversaturation. Metal's becoming a bit more vogue, it's becoming less fringe. We're dealing with a digital revolution, which is killing the revenue stream. I think that's why I think it's a tale of perseverance more than innovation in that particular era. But yeah, I think when you put it like that, you are absolutely right. These are all debuts. These are all like, it's a tale of artist development, isn't it? Really. It's a tale of recognizing potential and exploiting it to remarkable success. And this is only 6 years after 7 years after the US office opens, and Roadrunner moves from like a 10-person operation to more. It is quite remarkable. And again, it's just about me trying to unpick that, and obviously finding patterns where there are none. But the biggest thing is that the people there really give a massive fuck about the bands, a massive fuck. And it's dawning on me now that was usually the difference between the Roadrunner bands which did really well and the ones that didn't. it's usually because there was a champion of person. There's a few personnel in the company that were just championing these two people or these two bands or whatever. Like I was speaking to Mark Abramson last week about the Bloody Kisses Gold campaign, because that's what it was. It was a sustained campaign. It wasn't a fluke. It was Case sitting down with the head of sales and Mark Abramson saying, right, I want a gold record now, lads. What do you reckon? And they pick from the list of that artists and go, Typo Negative's your one. We're going to get the credibility for the label now. Let's do it. And Mark Emerson just fucking loves Typo to death, has a great relationship with the band, just pushes and pushes and pushes and pushes. And that's what generated that repertoire and that credibility that the label and Case really wanted at that point.
Well, it's an unbelievable, but like, by the way, an unbelievable gold record to get for your first gold record. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I will speak, anyone who speaks to me for more than about 4 minutes knows that Typo Negative are pretty much, I think, are the best thing that's ever happened to the planet. But, you know, like, they're fucking unbelievable. But they're so unique. And I think, again, that's, you know, to get a band that unique, a gold record, it's not like, I mean, you know, were it to have been Burn My Eyes, say, was the first gold record. Like, Burn My Eyes is an absolutely phenomenal record, an incredible record. But Burn My Eyes is a metal record, you know, it's a kind of groove metal record, and there were plenty of them around at the time. There's nothing like Typo Negative. And I think that was the kind of beauty of like, I don't think Typo Negative could have been on another label. You couldn't have had Typo Negative on Earache Records. It wouldn't have made any sense. Like, they wouldn't have fit in amongst any of their other, even though they kind of come through death metal and hardcore a bit. Typo Negative, the band, just would not fit on that label at all. And
yeah,
that's, again, you know, that's the kind of beauty of, I always thought the beauty of Roadrunner is not only did they find massive, unique metal bands, they found metal bands, they made people successful who really had kind of no right to be successful. Slipknot don't really have the right to be as, like, Iowa was number one, the biggest album of a week when the Strokes album came out. Like, I mean, if you were there and you remember the hype for the Strokes, it was, I mean, inescapable hype for the Strokes. And people also, I mean, it seems ridiculous to say now, but for the boy band Five, you know, they were massive. That boy bands were massive at that time, and yeah. Five were like Britain's answer to NSYNC or whatever. And this fucking bunch of loons in masks with blast beats were bigger than both of them.
Yeah,
like, it's just it couldn't happen again. Yeah, I know people like to go, "Oh, it couldn't happen. It was a great time because it wouldn't happen anymore," and look back like the kind of halcyon days. But that's never going to happen again.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think to speak again on the Bloody Kisses campaign, they are a band like no other, and this is why the struggle to get it, and I'm going to call it a struggle to get it gold, is so remarkable because no one wanted to, it was, a lot of it was driven by radio. Yeah. No one wanted to play Black Number One. They were like, this isn't going to vibe, and it was down to the team and the relationships they built with the industry to say, no, play it. We're really pushing this. And I think that just speaks again to the tenacity of the brand. I hate using the word brand because I know I'm shilling for a company, but when I use the word brand, it feels dirtier. It speaks to the tenacity of the company to say, this weird shit, we're pushing it and we're not going to relent. And I think that's, again, something that speaks to the Slipknot experience. But let's talk about the elephant in the room about an indie metal label that goes platinum twice in about less than a year, maybe 6 months. So we got Slipknot and we've got Nickelback Silver Side Up as well.
Yeah.
That to me is an incredible catalyst for the label. It comes at a time where things start to go slightly. The very start of them being acquired by Warner starts in that 6 month, 12 month period. Once they were partially acquired by Def Jam. So all of a sudden the management incentive structures changed, which then carries on, and then the personnel from Universal go to Warner, which creates the Warner acquisition, and then we end up in 2012 when it all goes over. The one thing I observed from that particular period is once an independent has a platinum, or once an independent has million sales, your profit and loss sheets year on year are going to change. So the year that Iowa comes out, you're in the black and everything's great. But the next year, if you've not got another Iowa coming out, you don't look as good. You know, you've gone from platinum to we're back to doing indie stuff this year, and then we've got Silver Side. Well, we got the Nickelback follow up the following year, and we're back up again. And I think this is where it starts to go on to not to shaky ground, but it's the incentive structure changes. The people in the building understand that things aren't quite what they were. But yeah, let's just talk about the explosion of those two bands. So one thing, because I don't know that, because I was 10. So I understood there were some people with Slipknot hoodies at school, but I didn't get it until, say, like volume 3. Right. But the watershed moment appears to be Ozfest 99.
Yeah. I mean, the Slipknot thing was pretty mad. I mean, obviously it was pretty mad. But they just sort of, I was very cynical when I first saw Slipknot. I was 19 and I had heard a lot of bands. Like, I got into Korn probably around the time that we're talking about Sepultura and all that kind of stuff. Got into Korn and loved Korn. And then suddenly and then I heard Deftones, and then I heard Incubus probably, and then that became Cold Chamber, which became Spineshank, which became like, yeah, this is not as good actually. So I think System of Down, I think I've said before, like System of a Down sort of shook me out of that stupor for nu metal for a little bit. But you started seeing the way that Cold Chamber dressed, and, you know, Static X were a band that I actually quite liked, but silly hair and, you know, silly, dressed up a bit silly. Everyone looks a bit like ludicrous and cartoony at this point. Yeah. And these guys could turn up with these masks and you're like, oh, here we go. Like, yeah, fine, whatever. Like another bunch of but even, you know, it wasn't even the internet then. You know, it wasn't even like there was people were on Twitter posting videos of Slipknot at the Ozfest or whatever. But despite that, they kind of went, they did go sort of viral. I mean, a lot of it was through Kerrang and Metal Hammer, because there was they'd have, I don't know if you remember this, but in Kerrang they'd have like a column from this, or they have like a road report from the Ozfest, and just the odd little bits here and there where you'd be going, oh, that's really mad, that, isn't it? And my mate went to America for the summer in 1999. He came back wearing a Slipknot t-shirt, and we went to a rock club in Reading. And when I realised, I was like, fucking hell, people are really going mad for this band. He wore his Slipknot shirt. It's before the album came out. He wore a Slipknot shirt in a rock club in Reading, and someone offered him 150 quid if he took it off then, and he would have swapped t-shirts with him. He was like, I'll go and get 150 quid out of the cash machine now if you give me that t-shirt. And he was like, nah, I'm not doing that. Because he would have been walking around in some other guy's sweaty t-shirt probably. But it was that was when I was like, fucking hell, people are really going for this. And I bought Slipknot self-titled album on the day it came out, and I remember being like quite kind of arms folded, like, go on then, impress me. And as soon as you heard it, it was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, fair enough, you are really good. I mean, you are really good. And you know, I saw, and yeah, the people were chatting about, you know, you heard the stories about sniffing dead crows in a jar. Corey wasn't allowed to talk on the Ozfest until he got on stage. You know, there were kind of videos, like stills of videos popping up of them playing live in Kerrang and stuff. They were saying they flip a coin and punch each other in the face. I went to the Astoria show, the first UK show. I was at that, and it was quite a thing to see them come out. I mean, weirdly, it's gone down as this legendary gig. You know, it actually, they weren't as good as, they weren't actually as good as the world makes it out. It wasn't actually as good as the world makes it out to be, that gig. Like, the sound was atrocious. You couldn't hear what they were doing. You couldn't hear what they were playing. They were all over the place. It was a mess. I mean, it was really, really exciting. But I wouldn't say they're actually that good. I'm like, no, they weren't actually like a good band. They weren't a tight band. It was a fucking chaos. Yeah. It was just pure chaos. And I was like, I don't know what the song is. Like, Corey can barely sing with the like he was going crazy, and you couldn't breathe through the mask and stuff. I still think they were sort of finding their feet weirdly, like, but they'd only been playing for it was only about a year since they were playing these songs live, and to be selling out this story. But it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. Like, it used to be, you go to Astoria and you'd queue up about an hour before the gig. And I went down there. I used to go to London sort of the day of the gig. And I went down there at about 2:00. We walked past the Astoria, and there were people in masks hanging off of the building, like in boiler suits. And it was like, it's the closest thing to, I mean, people always go, oh, it's like Beatlemania and all this. But it was genuinely the closest thing I've seen in metal to some kind of Beatlemania, like Spice Girls, fucking Michael Jackson chaos. It's the only time I've ever seen that with any band, like Metallica, made, like whoever. Like, I've never seen that before.
I sometimes think a label's job is to create the atmosphere that you'd have before that gig, which is like, there's a massive buzz, there's something going on here. And obviously Slipknot delivered that in absolute fucking spades, because a lot of the conversation or the dialogue from them at the time was like, it's all about the artist and it's about the artistic integrity. They're all in boiler suits and masks, and there's like there's a familial dysfunction to the whole thing, which was just super fucking compelling to the average listener as well. And that all boils up into just nut jobs in fucking boiler suits banging up fucking buildings, like you say.
Yeah.
It's
getting them on like shit, like getting them on TFI Friday, like, and getting them like playing Top of the Pops and stuff. It's like, you've brought this band on here to gawp at them and laugh. Like, really, let's be honest. Chris Evans got Napalm Death on because he was like, look at the funny band. Do you know what I mean? And like, when they went on TFI Friday, they were going on there because everyone was like, oh, this is weird, isn't it? They were there as a freak show. But I think what those people in the mainstream probably didn't anticipate was that by doing that and by kind of treating them as this weird thing, all they were really doing was exposing them and stoking the kind of the thing in people that made them, like, for all the people who would have been sat at home, like they did when Baby Metal played Stephen Colbert, and you saw loads of tweets going, sack your music booker. I'm sure there were like hundreds of people who went, this is amazing. Yeah. This is what I've been waiting for this for so long. And even more so in a kind of pre-internet age, to see Slipknot and their fans nick a camera on TFI Friday on a Friday, like, if you're a suburban kid who has heard a few Nirvana songs, or like is aware of Marilyn Manson or Hole or whatever, or whatever was big at that time, to see that, you're not going to be going like, oh, this is just, I'm calling Ofcom. No, fuck that. You're going to be like, this is the best thing I've ever seen in my life.
I think like that kind of as a that thing in our heads that relates to that kind of stuff, it goes all the way to 2006 with Hard Rock Hallelujah. Yeah. It's a fuck you, isn't it? Really. Yeah. To some people, it's, as you say, what is this? Poke it a little bit. For some people, it's like, oh, this is a massive fuck you to this shit that's been on every Friday for the last 5 fucking years. It's boring me to death. Yeah,
there's not many of those things. There's like you said, there's that. There's Rage Against the Machine getting to #1, Christmas #1, Slipknot on TFI Friday. There's not a lot of those things. There's not a lot of them. I mean, when you think like, I don't know, it's such a different thing, because I look at like Sepultura on the Word, Sepultura or Corrosion of Conformity played on the Word on Channel 4. You think, well, that should be a big thing. But actually, that kind of felt a bit more normal because the Word was supposed to be anarchic and stuff. Whereas TFI Friday, you're getting like Jerry Halliwell coming on as a guest, and it's all Jules Holland and stuff like that. And their musical guests were usually someone like
clean cookie cutter.
Yeah. So it did feel like, and it was on at sort of 6 o'clock in the evening as opposed to 11 o'clock at night. So it did feel like I think that was a massive thing. But yeah, like they just, I mean, it's not even when I say, oh, it couldn't happen now. I think if a band came along and tried to behave the way that Slipknot did now, I don't think people would, I think people would be too cynical to even allow them to do that. But they were they were just so even if you didn't quite buy into it, you had to go like fair play to them for like they are not doing anything by half measures.
Mm.
And I think the label, like to go kind of tie it back into Roadrunner, you'd been having kind of like slightly diminishing returns for a few years. Like I say, Fear Factory had become Coal Chamber had become Spine Shank. So those bands are not as revered. They're not selling as much, and let's be honest, they're not as good, right? And then Slipknot come along, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, Roadrunner's still cool. And then you get shit like, you know, Glassjaw and the Workhorse Movement coming a year or so later, which it don't have the same impact as Slipknot did when what could really, but still, you know,
It gives them the
I was like, oh yeah, you've got a bit of a second wind here. That's how I felt.
underground credibility.
Yeah,
maintains. Yeah. How are you doing for time? This has gone really quick.
that's all right. Don't worry. I'm fine. Continue.
Perfect. Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about Nickelback, because these are the two totem poles which sort of this era is bookended by. Did you have reverence for Nickelback in any way, or would...
No, no, not at all. Yeah, I'm oh God, what to say about Nickelback? I mean, I'm not surprised they're big because they know their way around a stupid hook, don't they? But but they're not. I mean, I don't want to listen to Nickelback. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to listen to Nickelback. And I understand that there are people who I know, like when Nickelback came out and it was a whole thing, like they've stripped Soundgarden of all of the nuance and heart and blah blah blah, and that is true. Like they are essentially, like, I guess, a kind of post grunge band.
Yes.
Grunge was, you know, again in 99, 2000, 2001, grunge was not cool. Grunge was very, very uncool, and I think like all of the bands who were kind of like the big four of that, it was only really Pearl Jam who was still doing anything, essentially, wasn't it? And they were very much not a grunge band anymore. And you've also got kind of no Screaming Trees is split up, and Mudhoney weren't really doing anything. And it was looked at as a bit of a relic. But then what was left were bands like Bush and Stone Temple Pilots a bit as well. And I think, you know, like I actually like both of those bands, but there's still, when you get to kind of Creed, Days of the New and Creed and that kind of thing, which is a bit more kind of American radio rock as opposed to anything to do with punk rock, I'm not really going to be that interested in that. I mean, even though Soundgarden is sort of famously like Zeppelin meets Black Sabbath, they're still a punk band. Like, it still started off as a punk band. I think if you take that away from that, then what you've got basically is like just kind of quite angsty sounding 70s hard rock, which is what Nickelback were. But Nickelback were almost like more like 80s glam, but in a mood. And I was like, no, I can't have this. I think I don't want to say they're rubbish. I think they're rubbish, but I don't necessarily think they're bad at making music. I totally can understand the appeal. I mean, people.
Yep. Yeah, it's totally accessible, and I think this is something which I think Roadrunner wanted in the 90s. They wanted something accessible and contemporary to keep the fucking lights on. Maybe not to keep the lights on, but to innovate. But that's what Nickelback ended up doing. It was just keeping the lights on while Glassjaw were running about, and Jesse Leach was scoring the first album for the Killswitch and whatnot. But it's I don't mind it because, again, it's a generational thing. I have reverence for them because I remember going into Halifax one day with some money, and I couldn't afford 2 CDs. But my mate came in with me, and we bought Silver Side Up and Wonder Boy single from Tenacious D, and we spent the rest of the evening playing Red Faction. And it was like, this is the greatest day ever. So I've got like a special place for Nickelback. I do understand the trajectory into the place where Imagine Dragons is now, which is, this is a procedural thing. It's not music anymore. If you ask me, I think there are some songs in there that you just got to strip the production value down, and you've got yourself a post-grunge band. And you've got yourself a post-grunge band with a post-grunge audience, which is fine. But I think the biggest impact they will have in relation to the Roadrunner story is creating that that major interest, that which is what triggered those events, which led to Roadrunner losing their independent status. And that's, again, like I say, it is the catalyst for better or for worse. Yeah, but I'll move on to who's your favorite Roadrunner artist then? If you had to pick one gun to your head.
I'm probably going to say Sepultura. I think
Chaos or Root? Because there's no other option, is there?
Well, I don't know. There is actually. I think that run of four, that run of Beneath the Remains, Arise, Chaos AD, and Roots is the reason why I would pick Sepultura.
Yeah,
I think it's between them and Typo Negative. It is between them and it might be Typo actually. It actually might be Typo. No, I don't know. It's one of those two. I think for me, Typo have about three. They have a bountiful, endless, great songs. They have one or two great, like truly great albums, and they've got a couple of really good albums. But overall, like just everything about them is amazing.
Yeah.
Also, Dead Again, which is one of my favorites, is not actually on Roadrunner, so
no,
cut that out. But I think
that was my first Typo record.
That's a brilliant record.
It is great.
So good. Yeah, it's an amazing record. But I'm going to have to go with Sepultura because I think they did. To me, they're kind of like the definitive example of all the stuff that Roadrunner was. You know, you've got a very kind of like in 1989, you've got a really kind of this kind of brutal, quite rudimentary, blackeny thrash record in Beneath the Remains. Yeah, which is, you know, borrowing very heavily from Slayer, and you know, comes out of Brazil and is so like earthy and dirt. And I think, you know, there's a brilliantly youthful charm about that record, which is probably my fourth favorite of the four, but I still think it's amazing. I think Arise is fucking unstoppable, and I think there are a lot of people who do think Arise is like the best one, and that to me is where Sepultura become a ferocious metal band. Like, you know, Arise to me is a death metal record, like a full-blown death metal record, and you know, it's great. And then when you get to Chaos AD is when you kind of get big hits, big booming, groovy, awesome, you know, but still kind of linked to that underground stuff. And then Roots is a funny one because I always say that Roots is, if you're a metal fan, Roots isn't going to be your favorite. If you're a music fan, it will be. I think metal fans like to get kind of bogged down in how technical things are and how difficult they are and how interesting and intricate the riffs are. And I think most music fans don't give a fuck about that. They like some sort of emotion. And I think you've got comfortably the best Max Cavalera vocal performance on Roots. Comfortably. I think you may not have the most intricate and difficult music, but you've got the broadest breadth of sonic ideas across Roots. I think it's just so low as well, you know, and it ushered in. Now, people call it a new metal album. I mean, it doesn't sound like Power Man 5000, does it? Let's give dudes here. You know, it obviously inspired a lot of things.
It's the new metal in the same way that Fear Factory inspired metalcore.
Yeah,
there's some DNA in there, but it's not.
Or how Domination by Pantera inspired Beatdowns. Like, yeah, I get it. Like, it sounds a bit like that, but I think there's way more to that record than I think people like to go, oh, it's the one where they did new metal. There's no rap on it. There's no like, do you know what I mean? There's no jump the fuck up, or do you know, it's bollocks. I think that record's brilliant. Yeah.
It's interesting when you mentioned if you're a music fan, it's Roots. If you're a meta fan, it's one of the three, because there is always debate raging about those four, and I never really engaged in that debate until I started looking at this trajectory and those years and going, oh yeah, there's something potent about the way they delivered that, and there's something potent about the way everyone responded to it, because it was still fringe, very much fringe up until, say, Chaos AD, when it becomes a bit more of a credible thing. And that's a dynamic which is important, I think, especially if we're considering people like tarnishing Roots with the new metal tag, which is I
don't
think are disingenuous.
I don't think that's something that it's like, well, just listen to the records.
Oh, dude, it is. To bring it back, it's saying post 2010s Weezer is shit, which is a disingenuous assessment of the situation.
It definitely is. Yeah. I mean, I know like it's much cooler to say that Arise is the best one. And Arise is probably my second favorite of the four. And that's putting it above KSAD. And if KSAD is the third best album in a list of albums, then the first two have got to be pretty fucking special, I think.
Yeah.
So, it would probably be Sepultura by a whisker away from Type O Negative. I think are probably the most unique band of maybe the label's history.
I think mine is Type O, but I think it's because I'm find myself relating to the cynicism and kind of the darkness of it. No, dark seems too fucking romantic. It's just like a set of funny buggers doing music which is deliberately against the grain, and it just speaks to me in a way that they didn't do when I was 25. And I think that's just resonant.
So the irony of this is I hated Type O Negative when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I didn't understand. I thought it was totally serious. And it wasn't until I went, they're not really taking this too seriously, are they? As when I went, oh, I see. Oh, it's amazing now. Yeah.
When you realize music can be that, it changes your entire fucking world, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, now I absolutely love it. I've got the I was nearly pulled out the Type O Negative vinyl box set that I've got there, which is like one of my absolute prized possessions. But that, actually, I've got that and the Sepultura vinyl box set behind me for those the Roadrunner years. It's not even the Roadrunner years because it's not got Against on it, which is no great loss to be fair. But I mean those. Yeah, it was just those two. I think to me feel like kind of the definitive Roadrunner bands from that year, I think.
Skipping around to the end of the story. In 2012, I'm just wondering, because it occurred to me, I should have asked you this in my email, but in your capacity as a journalist, obviously, you've got more of I guess you've got a contractual obligation to give a shit about the dynamics of the industry. So when the offices start closing in 2012, do you realize at this point, okay, this is the end of an era? Or are you more in a position of, well, realistically, the last great signing was, say, Gojira, and that kind of period, it's not like the 90s. So really, the industry's been done a favor by cross-pollinating all those Roadrunner personnel into the other parts of the industry. So what was, like, the day the axe fell, what was it like for you?
I mean, I wasn't really properly working that as much as I am now in the music industry at the time. So it's hard to say, but I do remember hearing about it, and it was painted from how I remember the kind of narrative was like Roadrunner is closing. Roadrunner is gone. And I was like, oh no, that's awful. It just was another reminder, like we'd had the Astoria has gone in London, where like I said, I've seen Slipknot and countless other bands. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, there's this kind of like the gentrification of metal and hardcore and punk and stuff has been going on for a while now. And it's weird that it's so like we are back to being super duper underground again, like really fucking underground as a movement, as a genre. And like it's very, very much underground. I think it probably gets more respect now than it probably ever has, but it's still not really, it's probably less of a big deal than it's ever been before as well. And the idea of Roadrunner not being there to me was just like, well, this just feels like another nail in the coffin of, I guess, a kind of, like it being a kind of feeling like I was part of a genuine, it feels a bit much to say like, oh, it's a genuine counterculture movement, but it kind of was, like, I don't think that's a stretch to paint it like that. I think it was our Roadrunner sort of represented like our forays into popular culture. Like it was the one place where you could go like, well, if I go there, then I've got a shot at actually like at least banging on the door of the mainstream a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's exciting personally. you know, I think Ministry headlining Lollapalooza, or, you know, fucking Sepultura on the Word, or like, those things are exciting. They're interesting. You know, you remember Mastodon went on Jules Holland?
Yeah.
It felt like years since anything like that had happened before. And, you know, it was just like, it felt like a big deal. It felt like an exciting thing. And you just love to see those little moments. I imagined in my head, it's like, well, it's going to be more difficult to do that without something like Roadrunner, because I don't see Metal Blade being able to facilitate that. I don't see Earache being Earache at this point is signing Rival Sons and, you know, Blackberry Smoke and stuff. And it's like, I think even they appeared aware that, like, well, you know, it's like, we need to make money. You know, we'll sign some metal bands, but this is where our bread is buttered, essentially, and this is the priority. So yeah, it was just sad. You know, it was just sad to see. But then there is still a Roadrunner Records.
There is still a Roadrunner Records. That is true.
There is still a Roadrunner Records, and they still are a thing. I mean, you can go, yeah, but they're not really, and blah blah blah. You know, the music industry and labels and stuff now they're sort of they're much more arbitrary than they ever have been before, ever. And you can self-release something, and you can go on and become a platinum selling artist, or you can go to a major label and you end up broke within a year. Like, I don't think those things, they unfortunately, whether we like it or not, don't really make any difference, really. And it means that something like Roadrunner Records can't really mean what it used to mean, because it can't, because nothing does. Oh,
that's such a great way to bookend that the journey of that label, because if it died 5 years later, it would, I say died, if it had been taken over 5 years later, it would have lived long enough to see itself become the villain in that arbitrary world, possibly. But also there's what you said before, which is like, it was sort of weirdly incestuous seeing all these bands, and there's like, it was, I don't know, you put it much better than I could ever articulate. Much better than and you've thrown some great sound bites out there which I've never thought of, and some great angles. Let's do the top 5 Roadrunner records, and let's see your list. Let's do it.
Do you want these? I'm going to put these in chronological order.
Go for it. Because there is no true order, is there? It changes every day.
Can't pick a kind of favorite. So I'm going to pick. Roots first, for all the reasons I've just detailed. Don't think we need to go into Roots anymore. October Rust would be my second pick. I think October Rust is the best Type of Negative album. I think it's the most romantic Type of Negative album, probably the funniest Type of Negative album as well. It's, the production is beautiful. You know, it's them at their, I guess they're least abrasive and their least heaviest, but also for me, kind of probably their most challenging. I love the kind. I love hearing a metal band lean in on, like, way before him, leaning in on romanticism. And it's quite funny to think, in an era when, you know, Korn came out, and then you've got, like, the Great Southern Trendkill came out that year, like the most brutal Pantera album, and death metal was still like a big thing. And I think, like, Corpse Grinder's first album with Cannibal Corpse came out that year, I believe. And and you've got people kind of trying to be heavier and heavier. At that point, I still think, you know, the kind of the heaviness wars were being dialed up as much as they possibly could. So for the only platinum selling band, or the only kind of gold selling band on that label, to turn around and make a Bauhaus, Cure, Lovecraftian romance album is fucking brilliant. And, like, it could not be more against the grain. Like, amazing. Fucking awesome.
When I introduce people to typo, I call it sex metal. I think that's the quickest way to get the point across. Yeah,
it absolutely is. And particularly on that album, it's like, you know, this massive guy being slinky as fuck. Like, so good. And just the best songs, really, as well, isn't it? Like, some of those songs are just fucking incredible. So that would be my second pick. My third pick, I briefly mentioned it before, would be Imprint by Resident Disorder. which is the best Vision Disorder album. There's not as much competition as there is from like Temperature and Typo. For that, I think the debute's really good. I think they made some excellent albums. They've made a couple of really good albums since they came back in 2012. But Imprint is, it's so savage.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's hardcore. For me, it's the first. It's proto metalcore.
Yes.
It's metalcore before metalcore was
absolutely
terminology. I mean, Rorschach and Integrity, and yes, if you want to go all the way back to Agnostic Front and Crossover and DRI and all that stuff, right? Yeah,
fine.
That's a thing, definitely, right?
It's the cleanest, most central line in the family tree.
It's when you start bringing in melodic vocals and sort of soaring choruses over the top of really complex hard metal riffs played it by a hardcore band.
Yeah.
That kind of, I genuinely think that is the blueprint for everything else that went post that.
And if I'm not mistaken, you get a lovely Phil Anselmo cameo on one of the songs when he's, I think he's maximum heroin at this point.
Yeah, it's Phil Anselmo at his most aggressive, and it's death metal Phil Anselmo, and he sounds fucking great on it, but he still sounds like a little baby next to Tim Williams, who has got one of the most unbelievable screams. Like, Tim Williams is one of the great fucking lost vocalists ever. That dude has got an unbelievable voice. He's so great. And hearing that record, I mean, there's a few bands that kind of push me in the direction of when I got into shit like Converge and the like. And them and Willhaven would be the two where I'm like, okay, well, that was me getting into really, really extreme hardcore before. Because, you know, I like even hardcore bands I love, like Madball and Stick of It All, or like Earth Crisis as well. Like, but Earth Crisis and Madball obviously were both on Roadrunner. And, you know, those bands are amazing, but there's not the kind of the frantic, like Mike Baumbach, the again, unbelievably underrated guitarist Mike Baumbach, fucking great. And so that would be my number 3. If you haven't heard that record, that's probably the least sort of big one, I reckon, on this list. You have to go and listen to that record. Number 4, I'm going to pick Le Fond Sauvage by Gojira. I nearly picked Magma, but I think Le Fond Sauvage is, I mean, it's not actually my favourite Gojira record, but I think it is the best example of why people like Gojira.
Right.
I want to pick something a bit more modern. I think they kind of took the death metal, the eco death metal thing to the absolute pinnacle. I don't think I think Magma, when people kind of had a go at Magma, it's like, well, I don't think they could have done anything after Le Fond Sauvage that would top that. I just don't think that's possible. It's too good at doing that thing. And I don't even think it's the best Gojira album. I mean, they're incredible.
I haven't started listening to Gojira. I've seen him twice. I haven't listened to him until I heard your review the other week.
Yeah.
So they're one on my list to just work through properly. Listen to Vision of Disorder and some of the obscure shit on Roadrunner part of this project. But for some reason, I've been ignoring Gojira, and I'm doing myself a disservice.
Mate, they are absolutely unbelievable bands. Unbelievable. They're phenomenal. So I wanted to pick something a bit newer, and I wanted to pick something really new. And some people might, some people might not be surprised if they know what I like, but Underneath by Code Orange would be my 5th one.
Yeah.
Because that is the first time in a long time. I hear metal a lot, and I get and get excited by it. Like, I think it's hard to listen to a genre which is quite regimented in what it's meant to be for 25 years and to not get a little bit fatigued by it. I know you said something to me about Evile. I'd be interested in what that was, because that was one of the sort of things I'm like, this is good. I've heard it loads before. Doesn't mean it's not good. If this is your first time hearing a metal band, you probably think it's really exciting. I don't feel like that because I've heard this so many times. There are lots of metal bands. I've heard lots of metal albums. when I get excited about music, like really super excited, it does still happen that you can get really, really excited by music. But for me at the moment, like I said at the start, it's hearing something like Clipping, hearing like experimental hip hop, or hearing some kind of ambient dream pop album and going, oh, I've not really listened to anything like this for a long time. This is really, really exciting. But Code Orange are one of the few times in the last however many years, probably the last 5 years or so, where I've heard a metal band who I think are both incredibly exciting musically and interesting and diverse and forward thinking and innovative, but also that I think everybody would like.
Yeah.
Like when I listen to Typo or Fear Factory or those bands, I do think there's such an obvious reverence for that period of Roadrunner. That's why it's great that they're on Roadrunner as well, I think, because there's such a massive obvious reverence for that period from that band. But also they're tapping into things that I think metal fans don't really even think about that much. Like knowing the kind of hip hop that they listen to, knowing that the kind of electronic music they listen to, knowing about, you know, the tones and the movies and the art that they pay attention to that goes into that. I think if you yourself don't pay attention to any of that stuff and you just listen to metal, I think you listen to Code Orange and go, this is cool. They remind me of Sepultura on Roots, or they remind me of Fear Factory. That's great. But if you do have those other reference points, they have so much more, and you don't have to have them to enjoy it. If you do, it makes them seem so much more exciting. I think they are fucking brilliant.
That's another band I haven't checked out.
Oh, mate, you have to do that.
I'm shit at this, huh?
Yeah. Oh God, Yeah, they're unbelievable. Code Orange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that fifth?
That is 5. Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. That's a great eclectic mix.
I was gonna pick the More Things Change by Machine Head as well, but the wild of it.
Yeah. For me, I don't even think I have a top 5 because I'm still unpacking this as I go through, because it just turns out when you try and take a magnifying glass to this kind of thing, you realize, oh, there's actually a shit ton of stuff that no one's ever heard about. Yeah, that's worth digging into. I had someone send me album by a band called Anyone. It's just
I remember that. They're a bit like Jane's Addiction. I think they were one of the ones that kind of that was a big drop off. And Step Kings were another one that came at the same time.
Yeah, but I really like the Anyone record. It's just like
I don't remember.
It's sort of like been called acid new metal. Yeah. So it kind of like it takes the new metal formula, but it makes it much slower, much more chilled out, and it just doesn't take itself very seriously. And it delivers it at a time where the aesthetic kind of fits that non-serious vibe. For example, like it's like a Tony Hawk sort of aesthetic. We're just having fun with it, and it kind of works for me. But yeah, there's things like that which are stopping me from like building a top 5 list, because I'm like, But I guess if you asked me today,
they got a lot of hype. Anyone, you know, they were very much. I thought they were going to get pushed really fucking hard. There was a lot of chatter like this is the next big band that rode, you know, it's kind of just after Slipknot. This is what I mean, like a drop off. Like Anyone were a band who, like, nobody talks about them now. I'm quite glad you brought them up because I'd forgotten their name, but I was going to say there was this band, and I do remember like Step Kings was another one, obviously like 36 Crazy Fists, and Downer was another one. Ultra Spank on Roadrunner, I'm not sure if they were, or Kilgore, I can't actually remember, but there were a few bands. Kilgore, I think might have been, and like Floodgate and stuff like that was that album was really good. Yeah, but and like kind of Slow Burn and Karma to Burn, and and all that stuff. And like it was such a weird thing. But Anyone were a band who I remember there was a massive thing about them in Metal Hammer. Oh, they're going to change what music is, and you know, they pushed that shit real hard, and just no one went for it. It's kind of quite hard to get bites. There was a couple of years, I guess that's why Nickelback was so kind of essential for them, because after Slipknot, you're right, there were a few things they were like, well, somebody needs to bite on this, and it didn't really happen with Glassjaw, didn't really happen with anyone. Didn't really happen with the Workhorse Movement. Was another band who was like, oh, the Workhorse Movement are like Southern fried rap band, whatever. You know what I mean? Amen as well. Amen had one album out, one really great album, but were just too fucking abrasive and then left. I think they didn't get on with the label.
I think it's something to be said about the ones that don't catch the bite, right? Because I think the unspoken thing is that the cash flow situation at any record label is so fucking delicate. It's and I say it's a lot about the deals that they gave their artists, because it's usually like $5,000 for an advance, and that was kind of a lot for the debut. But when you think about the amount of stuff they're pushing out every year, and the amount of licensed goods that the licensed records from other labels that they're putting out in different territories, it must be every year is a massive fucking gamble. So to have something like a Slipknot or a Nickelback that's keeping the lights on must have been a massive safety net to allow them to innovate, I guess, and try and take chances, especially in that period.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, you know, it was interesting what you said about the kind of balance sheet going up and it not looking as good the second year. A metal label doing what they were doing should never have expected it to have gone up to that point anyway.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like this is the thing where people, you know, your eyes get a little bit bigger than your belly, and you should never have expected Slipknot to happen, let alone twice. Once is mad, twice, you fucking nuts. It's not gonna happen. And it didn't.
And then you got to think in that dynamic, and people's relationship with the numbers. This isn't the metalheads who are going, oh, great, our eyes have gotten wider, Slipknot's gone great, we're going to have loads of platinums. This is a then 60-year-old Dutch opera fan who is at the helm. That's the key thing in terms of the decision-making from that point on.
But you would think that even just a basic rudimentary understanding of what the world is like would make people, I mean, this is the thing that I've always found really again, like the post-Nirvana major label rush to sign shit like Helmet and Cop Shoot Cop and the Melvins and Drive Like Jehu. Like, what the fuck were you thinking? Like, what the fuck did you honestly think you were going to get the next Nirvana? Like, no, that happens once. That happens for one generation. You know, you don't get, you might make a bit of money out of it, like whatever, but the idea that you could just sign another Slipknot, it's fucking like every year we're going to have another Slipknot. No, that's that's a once in a generational thing. And you look at it and you go, well, okay, so Cliff Richard was like the British Elvis, and we got a bit of money. Like, he sold a lot of records, and there might be something you can tag on next to it. When the Beatles happened and the British invasion happened, we managed to sell quite a lot of records of the Burn, and we like to sell, you know, the Who came, the Stones and all that kind of stuff came along as well. But you're never going to get another Nirvana.
No.
Like, you're not going to find it. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll unpack that as I go forward.
Well, silly. But yeah, I mean, I suppose you don't have to worry about it so much anymore.
I wanted to talk about other stories and things that I might have missed, but I wanted to open up with a story which complements your mate's Slipknot t-shirt story, which was, I was speaking to the king of the road team, or the road crew, like the street team from like the early 2000s. Because I think that's quite important in terms of presence. Ro Coley, also known as the Brown Satan. He got a t-shirt sent to him. I don't know if it was from Ozfest 99. It was just a friend who knew that Slipknot were about to break. And then he went to go see Static X. And then he's wearing the t-shirt. It says people equal shit on the back, blah, 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 blah. Someone pins him up against the wall and said, where the fuck did you get that t-shirt? Where the fuck is this coming from? And he said, oh, my mate who works at Roadrunner just sent it me. And it was Corey and Clown who thought someone was ripping their shit off.
Ha! Really?
Because it came out before anything came out. So it's interesting that there's like two stories of t-shirt related stories about Slipknot before Slipknot actually came out.
Yeah, that's mad. I mean, you know, like I say, it was a pretty mad time.
Yeah.
Real.
Any closing comments on Roadrunner? And then I can give you some stuff about Evil.
Okay, fine. Any closing stuff? Yeah, I mean, I think you're looking at absolutely a definitive something which has will always be a definitive moment and a definitive thing in the evolution of the popularization of metal, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you've got that kind of 80s boom with when Nuwobin and Priest and Maiden and Motorhead happened, and metal, and you know, this whole thing about metal was so big in the 80s, and it was the main thing in the 80s. And it's like, yeah, you know, like there were a lot of people that became interested in a type of metal in that period. But for me, what's so interesting about the 90s is that, you know, Maiden and Priest almost seem kind of cuddly in comparison with a lot of the shit that happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
It was fucking wild. It was a wild old thing to see Cannibal Corpse in Jim Carrey films. You know, that is not Iron Maiden on Top of the Pops. That is something very, very different. And Roadrunner were brilliantly positioned to kind of turn, you know, to kind of flip the cliches of what metal was meant to be or what heavy music was meant to be on its head. It was able to expose people to so much more than just a really, really cliched idea of what metal used to be 10 years before. What metal became in the 90s, I think, is, I mean, by the end of the 90s, arguably, we kind of jumped the shark a little bit. But certainly in that kind of period from 92 up to about 1999, I think heavy music was in such a kind of interesting place, and it wouldn't have been as interesting if it wasn't able to kind of flourish in places which it probably had no right to flourish in. And Roadrunner kind of facilitated that.
Yeah.
For a lot of different things. You know, like I said, Earth Crisis and Obituary and Vision of Disorder and Fear Factory playing main festival stages with the Foo Fighters and Ozzy Osbourne is mad. You know, that is an industrial death metal band. What right have you got to be in that place? Sepultura charting in the top 5 of the UK albums chart. Like, how? You're a death metal band from Brazil.
Yeah.
You're lucky anyone knows you're from Brazil. Like, I mean, just that alone. Like, if you take the individual component parts of Sepultura, one, you're from Brazil. Like, how many Brazilian bands get big in the UK? One, them. Mm. Two, you're a fucking death metal band. Like, how many death metal bands get big in it? Like, very, very few. But I don't know, it just perfectly packaged lots of things. It was able to kind of, I think, like I mentioned, there's less tribalization in the world now, and there was a lot more back then. But somehow, just like in heavy music, just like in the sound of aggressive music, was enough to kind of sustain lots of people into liking lots of things. And, you know, hardcore death metal, dance music, nu metal, groove metal, thrash, whatever you want to kind of pin your kind of mask to. I think Roadrunner kind of perfected it for everyone. Like, they made all the best records for a really, really long time. And, you know, and then even beyond that, you know, to kind of have that massive second wind, we've not even really spoken much about Trivium and Killswitch and the stuff that happened at that point, but they were still, you know,
relevant.
Yeah, vital, young, exciting bands. What other label could you be on? If you were one of those bands for so many years, if you were a metal band and you had the choice of everything, there's only one place where you would want to be. There's only one place that you would want to be, that you would trust with going, because that, you know, like I say, that it reads like the definitive list of bands from that period on one label. There's only a handful. There's only like 4 or 5 that we've mentioned that you go like, okay, Korn, Deftones, Pantera, Limp Bizkit maybe as well, System of a Down. That's it, isn't it, really? Marilyn Manson. That's it. Everyone else was on Roadrunner. It's insanity.
Yeah. You fucking schooled me and then some. I'm going to make a concerted effort to listen to Code Orange and Gojira.
Do.
Do you know, the way I've been tackling this, man, and this has been my fucking life for the past 8 months now. I go on Discogs and I catalog every single Roadrunner record that was not a licensed one, because there's a fuck ton in the 80s. That was their bread and butter. Yeah. And I'll listen to every single one to try and get a vibe from it. And I'm just not in the late 2000s. That's why they haven't come across my desk at all. Like, but it's so much fun to go back and go, why is Toxic a relevant thrash metal band? And can I speak to the drummer of Toxic about what they offered the brand and what they offered metal at the time? And that's the job. And I'm going to have to do it to Jugajiri and Code Orange for the same reasons, because the entire point of this thing is to reverse engineer the doings and happenings of Roadrunner and try and see if we could, what can we do for metal today as people of our generation? So yeah, I'll make an effort there. Let's talk about Evil for a bit. I liked the comments you made about thrash revival is boring as fuck. Eval are good. This new album's good. They're local lads for me. Mm-hmm. I supported them on a few, like when I was playing in bands around Halifax and Huddersfield. So they've always got like a special place, but that's rose tinted glasses. So it was good to hear like a good objective view of where thrash revival is and things like that. But when I started thinking about thrash revival, I had two questions. One, at what point is thrash revival just called thrash, right? When do we draw that line? And secondly, when I look back at like Eval, Gamma Bomb, Bonded by Blood, and those bands that came out in the mid-2000s, this was an earache initiative, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was actually. There were a lot of, Municipal Waste were on, they were on earache as well, weren't they? Mini Waste?
Were they? I'm going to check that. I know they're on Nuclear Blast now.
Yeah, I think Art of Partying, I'm pretty sure that was on earache. I'm pretty sure it was.
That was the best performing thrash revival album. There's been nothing that's topped that.
Yeah, I think that's the one that you look at and you think like, oh, that's clearly
the pinnacle.
Very, very good. I mean,
earache, yeah, they're earache.
Yeah, I thought it was. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Well, when does thrash revival become thrash? Well, I guess when the thrash revival starts to adopt its own sort of sense of personality, I think is the main thing for me.
Oh wow, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because because my angle is going to be, you're never going to get sort of like Bay Area thrash, late 80s, early 90s vibes. You're never going to get like a Gamma Bomb or an Eval exploding and playing arenas. It's always going to be this nearly nostalgic, not nostalgic. I think they do put their own stamps on it, but it's not like a movement of personality.
I think it's just, the one band that stand out for me, if you want to call it thrash, and the fact that I don't even really think of them as, I have to sort of actually go, oh, I suppose they're kind of a thrash revival band, but I don't think of them as one, is Power Trip, right? And that's because Power Trip, they're not really doing anything new, but they're doing something that feels so fresh.
Yeah,
I agree. Like I think that the Evil album that's just come out is good. I remember thinking Enter the Grave was good. I think the Art of Partying is really good, but you didn't. I don't look at Power Trip and go, you're kind of cosplaying 1986 Bay Area.
Yeah,
and so much of that is like, we dress like this, and our album covers look like that, and we have song titles that sound like that, and we're kind of talking about the same thing. It's produced the same. Oh, we'll get Flemming Rasmussen in to produce it. Like, how fucking blatant can you be? Luckily we didn't get to the Bob Rock era of the thrash metal revival. That would have been much fun. But I just think that like, it's absolutely fine to be a band who are a version of, there's Greta Van Fleet and bands like that. There's there's lots of things that are just kind of rehashes of stuff that's happened in the past, and it's often all right. But I think when you suddenly get like 9 or 10 of them, I just remember listening to it and being like, well, I don't feel like you've got. It's not even that you don't have an original thought in your head, but collectively, you as a scene and a movement, you are so wedded to this thing that happened in the past, and with no reinvention at all, like none. Like Havoc are a really great. Like I really like Havoc.
Yep.
Like they're fucking awesome, right? But they do not have an original idea in their collective heads that hasn't already been done in 1986, 1987. And thrash is a really I think more, maybe more than any other subgenre of metal, thrash, I think, is the most creatively stifling subgenre. Because even death metal, you can get melodic death metal, and you can get kind of brutal death metal, and then you can get slam, and you can get deathcore, and you get and people are, death metal is just death metal, but even death metal has adapted
to nuances.
Yeah, over the years. And I actually think you look at the box of what death metal can be, and it's still pretty small in terms of music, but you can get around a few more places. The box for what thrash is tiny, is so small. And I think it takes it would take a really, really special band to do something that, I mean, you know, for me, like, you look at the big four of thrash, and each one of them have their own unique spin on a thing, and no one else is ever going to be able to do anything which is topping that, I don't think, or changing that. It doesn't mean there aren't good thrash bands around. Testament were great, obviously. I mentioned Power Trip. I think Havoc are really good as well. I think Municipal Waste, we've already said, are great. Shit like Bonded by Blood, obviously, and a lot of stuff that Creator did. I mean, Creator have got about 4 or 5 fucking great records.
Yeah.
Early Sepultura, again, to mention that. Like, you know, there's loads of really good bands in thrash, but I do feel like, how much of this do I need in my life? There is so much music in the world. Do you know what I mean? There is so much music, not just so much thrash. There is so much thrash. But there is so much music in the world that to go, I am going to listen to the 150,000th version of this. I just can't find myself getting that excited about it. It's really difficult to get excited about that.
I think you're right. I think you're right on all points, and I think the market restricts it to, if you want to go and have a thrash night, if you want to have like a heavy metal parking lot evening, there will be an option for you within 25 miles of your house on a Friday night. And I think that's where it is, where it should be, and where it's almost designed to be by the bands themselves. The reason I'm really excited about Eval is because momentum was lost, and because there was a dynamic shift, and because they're a lot older now than they were, and the priorities are completely different, and the incentive structure is more realistic. So I think if there's ever going to be an innovation, it's going to be in the next 5 years with that band. I think they're in a completely different place than they were when Digby from Eric said, we're doing thrash revival, let's get you on this compilation record. And I just think everything's poised for something interesting to happen. And Hell Unleashed is good. It's a really great record, and I think it is just a balls out thrash record, and it's kind of, in the wider spectrum, it is a rehash. But when you think of the personalities there and what's happened in the last 10 years, I think it's potent now, because they tried to do it with Skull and Five Serpents' Teeth. They tried to move it into a bit more of a progressive place and use Matt's vocals in a more dynamic way. And it does sound different. It doesn't sound, you can't like compare, say, Enter the Grave and Five Serpents to I can Kill 'Em All and Master of Puppets or anything like that. It's not that breadth, but it was a development. And I think if they just keep the hunger there in this new dynamic of them all personally, it should be really interesting and really good. And they're local lads, so I'll always back them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good album. It's definitely, like, if you want to listen to a metal album and you've never heard before, and you like thrash, I think you'd really enjoy that record. It just depends how much you want to do that. Some people just want to listen to endless thrash metal, and that's absolutely fine. If that's what they want to do, that is absolutely fine. I personally would find that quite a dull existence, to be perfectly honest. But, you know, that's up to them if that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's cool. And so somebody should be making those records for them, I guess. I just think it would be better for the continued development of music as an art form rather than metal as a set of tropes for bands to actually go, fuck it, do you know what, fuck it, thrash metal has been done. Because it has been done. Like, you ain't making And Justice for All. That's not going to happen. Like, it's been completed. That game has been, the high score has been reached.
Not only was it reached, but there's also a backlog from the 80s which didn't make it.
Yeah,
There's a lot there which is now there.
Yeah. There's lots of really, really good bands from that period, and then I think it all just ran out of ideas, and no one's come up with any new ideas. And that is the like even the biggest bands in that scene. Megadeth don't have any new ideas. Slayer didn't have any new ideas for the last few records. Metallica certainly don't appear to have any new ideas. And then when they do have a new idea, and like Lulu, they get fucking shit on for it. I mean, say what you want. I mean, I know I don't want to go about talking about Lulu too much, but that is not A, not a Metallica album, and B, a brand new idea, and people fucking hate it. So why would you take a risk?
Yeah. I want to end on a more optimistic note, but I don't know what to do with it.
Well, it's still really good. Metal is still really good.
There we go. Right on.